The notification sound from my phone seemed louder than usual that Tuesday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee and scrolling through our bank statements like I did every month. After 32 years of marriage, David and I had our routines down to a science. He handled the investments, I managed the household accounts, and we always reviewed everything together on the first Tuesday of each month. But this particular morning would shatter everything I thought I knew about the man I'd shared my life with for over 3 decades. The email notification was from our bank's mobile app, something about account activity. I almost dismissed it. Probably just David moving money between our savings and checking like he always did. But when I opened it, my blood ran cold. The notification was for an account I'd never seen before. Account ending in 7294. We didn't have any account ending in those numbers. I stared at the screen, my coffee growing cold in my hands. There had to be some mistake. Maybe it was a glitch in the app, or maybe they'd accidentally sent me someone else's notification. But as I looked closer, I saw David's name clear as day. David Michael Chun, my husband of 32 years, had a bank account I knew nothing about. My hands were shaking as I clicked on the notification, half expecting it to tell me I didn't have access. But somehow it opened, and what I saw made my heart stop. The balance showed $47,000 that I had no idea existed. I sat there in stunned silence, staring at the numbers on my phone screen. In all our years together, David and I had never hidden money from each other. We'd been through financial struggles in our early marriage, the stress of raising 3 kids, putting them through college and planning for retirement. We'd always been a team, always been honest about every penny. So where had this money come from? And more importantly, why didn't I know about it? My mind started racing through possibilities. Maybe it was an old account he'd forgotten about? But the recent transaction history told a different story. Regular deposits every 2 weeks going back at least 6 months. The amounts varied. Sometimes 00, sometimes 200, but always on the same days. Fridays. I knew David's salary down to the penny. We'd just done our taxes 3 months ago. Gone through all his pay stubs together like we always did. These deposits were money I'd never seen, never accounted for. As I scrolled through the transaction history, my stomach dropped even further. The account wasn't just receiving deposits. There were withdrawals too. Large ones. 000 here, 500 there. And they were recent. Some as recent as last week while I'd been visiting my sister in Portland. I've always been the type of person who gives people the benefit of the doubt. When our neighbor Mrs. Patterson accused David of backing into her mailbox last year, I defended him even though I hadn't been there. When my sister suggested David seemed distant at Christmas dinner, I made excuses about work stress. I trusted my husband completely, maybe more than I should have. But sitting there in our kitchen, the same kitchen where we'd shared thousands of meals and conversations, looking at evidence of financial deception, I felt something I'd never experienced in our marriage. Genuine fear about what I might discover. I'd built my entire adult life around this man. We'd met when I was 23, fresh out of college and working my first job at a small accounting firm in downtown Seattle. David was 25, already established in his engineering career, confident and stable in ways that made me feel secure. He was the kind of man who paid bills on time, who planned for the future, who made lists and stuck to them. When we got married in 1991, I thought I'd won the lottery. Not because David was wealthy, he wasn't, not then, but because he was reliable. After growing up with parents whose marriage was a constant financial and emotional roller coaster, David's steadiness felt like coming home. We'd weathered every major life event together. When I was pregnant with our first child and scared about leaving my job, David assured me we could manage on his income. When his father died suddenly and left medical debts, we used our entire savings to help his mother. When I wanted to go back to school to get my master's degree in our 40s, David worked overtime for 2 years to cover the tuition. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. David's engineering career had progressed steadily, and my part-time work as a bookkeeper brought in enough to cover extras. We owned our house outright, had money in savings, and had managed to help all 3 of our children graduate college without debt. We were proud of what we'd built together. But now, staring at this secret account, I wondered what else I didn't know about the man I'd shared my bed with for 32 years. The sound of the garage door opening made me jump. David was home from his morning run, another routine that had remained constant throughout our marriage. Every morning at 6:30 a.m., he'd lace up his running shoes and head out for exactly 45 minutes. He'd return, shower, eat the breakfast I'd prepared, and leave for work by 8:15. I quickly closed the banking app and shoved my phone into my robe pocket, trying to compose myself. But as I heard his key in the door, my heart was pounding so hard I was sure he'd be able to hear it. "Morning, sweetheart," David called out, his voice exactly the same as it had been every morning for decades. "Beautiful day out there. You should have come with me." He walked into the kitchen, his gray hair slightly damp with sweat, wearing the same Nike running clothes he'd had for at least 5 years. Everything about him looked exactly the same as always. The way he moved, the way he smiled, the way he kissed my cheek before heading to the coffee pot. But I saw him differently now. As he poured his coffee and started his usual post-run routine, I found myself studying him like a stranger. Was there something different about his demeanor? Had he been more distant lately? More secretive? "You're quiet this morning," he observed, sitting down across from me with his coffee. "Everything okay?" The question hung in the air between us. Everything was not okay. Nothing would ever be okay again until I understood what that bank account meant. But I wasn't ready to confront him. Not yet. I needed to understand what I was dealing with first. "Just tired," I managed to say. "Didn't sleep well." David nodded sympathetically and reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "Maybe you should take it easy today. You've been doing too much lately with the gardening and helping Sarah with the baby." His touch, which had always been a source of comfort, now felt foreign. How could he sit there, looking at me with such apparent concern, knowing he was hiding nearly $50,000 from me? After David left for work, I sat alone in our kitchen for a long time, trying to process what I'd discovered. The house felt different now, like even the walls were keeping secrets from me. Every framed photo on the mantel, every piece of furniture we'd chosen together, every memory attached to this space we'd called home for 15 years. All of it felt tainted by the knowledge of his deception. I kept pulling out my phone to look at the account again, hoping somehow the numbers would be different, that I'd misunderstood what I was seeing. But every time I opened the app, the truth stared back at me. My husband had been hiding money from me for at least 6 months, possibly longer. The deposits were too regular to be accidental, too substantial to be insignificant. This wasn't a forgotten account or a small emergency fund. This was deliberate, systematic financial deception on a scale that suggested planning. Long-term planning. And that's when the most terrifying thought entered my mind. What if David was planning to leave me? The idea hit me like a physical blow. In 32 years of marriage, divorce had never seriously crossed my mind. We'd had our rough patches, what couple doesn't? But we'd always worked through them. We'd built a life together, raised children, survived losses and celebrated victories. We were supposed to grow old together, retire together, watch our grandchildren grow up together. But as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that the secret bank account wasn't just about money. It was about preparation. It was about David creating a financial foundation separate from me, separate from us. I thought about other changes I'd noticed over the past year, small things that hadn't seemed significant at the time. David had become more protective of his phone, taking it with him even when he went to the bathroom. He'd started working late more often, claiming new projects at work that required extra hours. He'd seemed less interested in making plans for our retirement, deflecting conversations about travel or downsizing our home. Were these signs I'd been too trusting to see? Had my husband been planning his escape while I was planning our future together? The morning stretched on, and I found myself unable to focus on anything. I tried to do my usual Tuesday tasks: laundry, grocery planning, paying bills. But my mind kept returning to that account. Those regular deposits, those mysterious withdrawals. Where was the money coming from and where was it going? I realized I needed to know more before I could even consider confronting David. If I was going to accuse my husband of financial betrayal, I needed to be absolutely certain of my facts. I needed to understand not just what he was doing but why. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done in 32 years of marriage. I started investigating my husband. I began with what I could access from home. I went through David's desk in our home office, looking through papers and files for any mention of accounts I didn't recognize. I found nothing obvious, but then again, if David was being deliberately secretive, he wouldn't leave evidence lying around. I checked our joint credit card statements going back 6 months, looking for any unusual patterns or expenses. Again, nothing jumped out at me. David's spending habits were exactly what I expected: gas, lunch expenses, the occasional purchase from Home Depot or his favorite sporting goods store. But as I was scrolling through the statements, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. For the past several months, David had been taking cash advances from our credit card. Not large amounts, usually 00 or 00 at a time, but frequent enough that I should have noticed. The advances always happened on Fridays, the same day as those mysterious deposits into the secret account. The pattern was becoming clearer, and it was worse than I'd imagined. David wasn't just hiding money from me. He was using our joint resources to fund his secret account. He was taking money from us to build something that was just his. I printed out the credit card statements and spread them on the kitchen table, highlighting every cash advance. Over 6 months, David had taken nearly 000 in cash from our joint account. Money that I'd helped earn, money that should have been ours, was being funneled into an account I wasn't supposed to know about. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd expected. This wasn't just about money. It was about trust, about partnership, about the fundamental agreement we'd made when we promised to share our lives. David was systematically undermining everything we built together, and he was doing it with resources that belonged to both of us. By the time David came home from work that evening, I was emotionally exhausted. I'd spent the entire day uncovering evidence of his deception, and I felt like I was living in a house of lies. But I still wasn't ready to confront him. I needed to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. "How was your day?" David asked as he hung up his jacket, the same question he'd asked thousands of times before. "Fine," I replied, though nothing about my day had been fine. "How was work?" "The usual. Johnson's been pushing us hard on the Morrison project, but we should have it wrapped up by Friday." He spoke so casually, so normally, that for a moment I almost convinced myself I'd imagined everything. This was David, my husband, talking about work projects and weekend plans just like he always did. But the evidence was right there in our home office, printed and highlighted, impossible to ignore. After dinner, David settled into his recliner to watch television while I cleaned up the kitchen. This was our routine, had been our routine for decades. But tonight, instead of joining him on the couch afterward, I excused myself and went to our bedroom. I lay in bed that night listening to David brush his teeth, listening to him move around our bathroom with the same familiar sounds he'd been making for 32 years. When he finally came to bed, he kissed my forehead goodnight and settled onto his side of the mattress, just like always. But as I lay there in the darkness, listening to his steady breathing, I felt like I was sleeping next to a stranger. The next morning, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable to me just 2 days earlier. After David left for work, I drove to his office. I'd only been to David's workplace a handful of times over the years, usually for company picnics or retirement parties. But I knew where he worked, knew his schedule, and knew that he usually ate lunch at his desk around noon. I parked across the street from his building and waited. I felt ridiculous, like a character in some daytime drama, but I needed to see if my suspicions about his behavior were justified. If David was planning to leave me, if he was having an affair, if he was involved in something that required secret bank accounts, maybe I'd see something that would give me answers. At 12:15, David emerged from the building. But instead of walking to the sandwich shop he usually frequented, he got into his car and drove in the opposite direction. I followed at a distance, my heart pounding with a mixture of guilt and determination. David drove to a part of town I rarely visited, an area with small office buildings and strip malls. He parked in front of a building I didn't recognize and went inside. The sign on the building read Cascade Family Law Offices. My blood turned to ice. David was meeting with a divorce attorney. I sat in my car across the street, staring at that sign, feeling like my world was collapsing around me. Everything suddenly made sense: the secret bank account, the cash advances, the subtle changes in his behavior. David wasn't just hiding money from me. He was preparing to divorce me. After 32 years of marriage, after building a life together, after raising 3 children and planning for our golden years, my husband was consulting with lawyers behind my back. The betrayal was complete and devastating. Not only was David planning to leave me, but he'd been systematically preparing for it while pretending everything was normal. While I was making plans for our retirement, he was making plans for his escape. I drove home in a daze, barely paying attention to the road. By the time I reached our house, I was alternating between rage and heartbreak. How could David do this to us? How could he throw away 3 decades of marriage without even trying to work through whatever problems he thought we had? But more than anything, I was angry at myself for being so blind, so trusting, so naive. The signs had been there, and I'd ignored them all. I'd been living in a fantasy while my husband methodically planned the destruction of our marriage. That afternoon, I called our lawyer, the family attorney who'd handled our wills and estate planning. I needed to understand my rights, needed to know what I was facing if David filed for divorce. "Evelyn," Margaret Thornton said when I explained why I was calling, "I'm so sorry to hear you're going through this. These situations are always difficult, especially in long-term marriages." Margaret had been our attorney for 15 years. She'd helped us with our house purchase, our wills, and various other legal matters. She knew our family, knew our financial situation, and I trusted her completely. "I need to know what I'm looking at," I told her. "If David files for divorce, what happens to our assets? What happens to me?" Margaret explained Washington's community property laws, how our assets would likely be divided, what I could expect in terms of spousal support. It was all very practical and logical, but it felt surreal to be discussing the dismantling of my life as if it were just another business transaction. "The secret account concerns me," Margaret said when I told her what I'd discovered. "If David has been hiding assets or dissipating marital property, that could work in your favor. Do you have documentation?" I told her about the printed credit card statements, about following David to the law office. Margaret listened carefully, taking notes. "I want you to gather as much financial information as you can," she advised. "Bank statements, investment accounts, retirement funds, credit reports, anything that shows the full picture of your marital assets. And Evelyn, I need you to be very careful not to let David know what you're doing until we're ready to act." "Act how?" I asked. "That depends on what you want," Margaret replied. "Do you want to try to save your marriage? Or do you want to protect yourself from what appears to be David's plan to divorce you?" The question hung in the air. What did I want? 24 hours ago, I would have said I wanted to grow old with my husband. Now I wasn't even sure I knew who my husband really was. "I need time to think," I told her. "That's understandable," Margaret said. "But don't take too long. If David is as far along in his planning as it appears, you need to be prepared to protect your interests." I spent the rest of that week in a strange sort of limbo, going through the motions of normal married life while secretly gathering evidence of David's deception. Every evening he'd come home and we'd have dinner and watch television and go to bed, just like we had for decades. But I saw everything differently now. I noticed how David's phone was always face down on the dinner table. I noticed how he'd started closing his laptop whenever I walked into the room. I noticed how he'd become vague about his work schedule, about weekend plans, about anything that might require him to account for his time. I also noticed things I'd overlooked before. David had lost weight in recent months, had started paying more attention to his appearance. He'd bought new clothes, had gotten a more stylish haircut, had even started using cologne again for the first time in years. These weren't the actions of a man planning to spend his retirement with his wife. These were the actions of a man preparing to re-enter the dating market. The realization hit me like a slap in the face. David wasn't just planning to divorce me. He was already imagining his life after our marriage. Maybe he'd already started that life. On Friday afternoon, I made another decision that would have been unthinkable to the woman I'd been a week earlier. I hired a private investigator. James Murphy was a former police detective who specialized in matrimonial investigations. Margaret had given me his number, explaining that while she hoped it wouldn't be necessary, it was better to have information than to be caught off guard. "I need to know what my husband is really doing," I told James when we met at a coffee shop downtown. "I need to know if there's another woman, if there are other accounts, if there's anything else I should know about." James was a kind man in his 60s with a sort of gentle manner that probably made his job easier. "These cases are never easy," he told me. "Are you sure you're prepared for whatever we might find?" Was I prepared? I'd been married to David for 32 years. I trusted him completely, built my entire adult identity around being his wife, his partner. Was I prepared to learn that it had all been a lie? I need to know the truth, I said finally. Whatever it is. James explained his process, his fees, what I could expect in terms of timeline and reporting. It all felt very businesslike, very professional. But there was nothing businesslike about the fear and sadness I felt as I signed his contract. That weekend, David seemed more distant than usual. He spent most of Saturday working in the garage, organizing tools and equipment for no apparent reason. On Sunday, he announced he needed to go into the office to catch up on paperwork. On Sunday? I asked. David had never worked on Sundays in all the years I'd known him. The Morrison project is behind schedule, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. I need to get some things sorted out. He left around noon and didn't return until after 6 p.m. When he came home, he seemed more relaxed than he'd been in weeks, almost cheerful. Whatever he'd done that afternoon, it hadn't been stressful office work. Monday morning brought another shock. I was checking our joint accounts online when I noticed a large withdrawal from our savings account. 0000 transferred out on Friday afternoon. The same day I'd seen David go into that cash advance pattern. The same day he'd been making deposits into his secret account. But this was different. This was a substantial amount of our joint savings, money we'd earmarked for home improvements and vacation plans. David had taken it without discussing it with me, without even mentioning it. I stared at the transaction, feeling a familiar mixture of rage and betrayal. How much more was there? How much of our life had been a lie? I called James Murphy. I need you to start immediately, I told him. My husband took $10,000 from our joint savings on Friday, and I need to know where it went. James's report arrived the following Wednesday, and it was worse than I'd imagined. David wasn't just planning to divorce me. He was already involved with another woman. Her name was Linda Morrison, the same Morrison as the work project David had been talking about for months. She was 43 years old, divorced, worked as a project manager for the architectural firm that was partnering with David's engineering company on various developments. They'd been seen together at restaurants, at a hotel during what was supposed to be David's business trip to Spokane last month, and at her apartment on the Sunday he'd claimed to be working. James had photos. David and Linda holding hands at a restaurant across town. David's car parked outside her apartment complex overnight. David and Linda embracing in the parking lot of the hotel in Spokane. The man in the photos looked like my husband, but he looked happier than I'd seen him in years. He was animated, smiling, clearly infatuated. He looked like a man in love. I sat at my kitchen table, looking at pictures of my husband's betrayal, and felt something break inside me. This wasn't just about money or divorce planning. David had fallen in love with someone else, and he'd been living a double life while I'd been completely oblivious. According to James's report, the relationship had been going on for at least 8 months. The Morrison project had been their cover story, their excuse to spend time together and travel together. All those late nights at work, all those business dinners and weekend meetings. They'd been building a relationship while I'd been home planning our future. The 0000 David had taken from our savings had been used to put a deposit on a condo where he and Linda were planning to live together. I called Margaret Thornton immediately. I need to file for divorce, I told her. Before David does. I want to protect whatever's left of our assets, and I want to make sure he doesn't get away with hiding money and planning his escape on my dime. Margaret was sympathetic but practical. Are you sure this is what you want, Evelyn? Once we file, there's no going back. If you want to try counseling or... No, I interrupted. David made his choice when he started planning his new life with Linda Morrison. He made his choice when he started hiding money and lying to my face every single day. I'm done being the fool who doesn't see what's right in front of her. That afternoon, I made a series of phone calls that would change my life forever. First, I called our children. Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah deserved to know what was happening, deserved to hear it from me before their father decided how to spin the story. The conversations were difficult, heartbreaking, but necessary. All 3 of them were shocked, angry, and supportive of whatever decision I made. Dad's been acting weird lately, Sarah said during our call. When I brought the baby over last weekend, he seemed distracted, like he didn't really want us there. Now I understand why. I can't believe he would do this, Jennifer said, her voice tight with anger. After everything you've done for him, for all of us. How could he throw it all away? Michael, our practical middle child, was already thinking about logistics. Mom, do you need help with money? With lawyers? Whatever you need, we're here. Their support meant everything to me. At least I wouldn't be facing this alone. Next, I called my sister Patricia in Portland. Patricia had never particularly liked David, though she'd been polite enough over the years. When I told her what was happening, her response was immediate and fierce. I'm driving down tomorrow, she said. You shouldn't have to deal with this by yourself. You don't need to, I started. Yes, I do, Patricia interrupted. You've been taking care of everyone else for 32 years. It's time someone took care of you. Finally, I called my best friend Susan, who'd been my maid of honor at my wedding and had remained close throughout our marriages and child-rearing years. Susan and her husband Tom had been friends with David and me for decades. They'd been to our house countless times, had celebrated holidays with us, had been part of our extended family. I can't believe it, Susan said when I told her everything. David always seemed so devoted to you, so committed to your marriage. I never would have suspected this in a million years. Neither would I admitted. I feel like such a fool. You're not a fool, Susan said firmly. You're a woman who trusted her husband and honored her marriage vows. David's the one who should be ashamed of himself. That evening when David came home from work, or from wherever he'd actually been, I watched him with new eyes. He moved through our house, our life, with the casual ease of someone who belonged there. But he didn't belong there anymore. He'd forfeited his right to our home, our routine, our shared life when he decided to build a secret life with someone else. How was your day? He asked, settling into his recliner with the newspaper. The question that had once been part of our comfortable routine now felt like mockery. How was my day? My day had been spent discovering the full extent of his betrayal, planning my legal strategy, and telling our children that their father had been living a lie. Fine, I said, just as I had been saying for weeks while I'd uncovered his deception piece by piece. But as I looked at him sitting in his chair, reading his paper, pretending to be the man I'd married, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. A sense of calm determination. David thought he was managing this situation, thought he was controlling the narrative and the timeline. He thought I was the same trusting, naive woman who'd been easy to deceive for 8 months. He thought he could plan his escape while keeping me in the dark until he was ready to reveal his new life. He was wrong. Thursday morning after David left for work, I implemented the plan Margaret and I had developed. First, I went to our bank and withdrew half of the money from all our joint accounts, depositing it into a new account in my name only. Under Washington law, I had every right to half of our marital assets, and I wasn't going to leave them vulnerable to David's continued financial deception. Next, I went to our safety deposit box and removed my personal documents, jewelry, and other items that belonged specifically to me. I also made copies of all our joint financial documents, property deeds, and investment statements. Then I did something that felt both scary and liberating. I changed the locks on our house. Our house was technically joint property, but I'd been the one making the mortgage payments for the past 5 years since I'd increased my bookkeeping work. I'd been the one maintaining it, decorating it, turning it into a home. David had been planning to abandon it for a condo with his girlfriend. If he wanted access to the house, he could ask for it through his attorney. I spent the afternoon moving David's clothes and personal belongings to the garage. I wasn't destroying anything or throwing things away, but I was making it clear that our shared living arrangement was over. If David wanted to continue living a double life, he could do it somewhere else. Patricia arrived from Portland around 4 p.m., took one look at me, and wrapped me in the kind of hug I'd needed for weeks. You look terrible, she said with characteristic bluntness, but you look determined. That's good. We spent the evening preparing for what we knew would be a difficult conversation. Margaret had advised me to have witnesses present when I confronted David, both for emotional support and for legal protection. Patricia would serve as my witness, and Susan and Tom were on standby if needed. At 6:30 p.m., David's car pulled into our driveway. I watched through the living room window as he tried his key in the front door, saw his confusion when it didn't work. He tried again, then walked around to the back door. When that key didn't work either, he knocked. I opened the door and saw my husband of 32 years standing on our back porch, looking genuinely puzzled. Evelyn, what's going on? My keys don't work. I know, I said calmly. I changed the locks. You changed the locks? Why would you change the locks? For a moment I saw a flicker of genuine concern in his eyes, and I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Come inside, David. We need to talk. He followed me into the kitchen, where Patricia was sitting at the table with a cup of tea, her presence both supportive and protective. David looked surprised to see her. Patricia, I didn't know you were visiting, he said politely. I'm not visiting, Patricia replied coolly. I'm here to support my sister while she deals with the mess you've made of her life. David's face went pale. What are you talking about? I reached into the folder I prepared and pulled out the bank statements, the credit card records, and several of the photos James Murphy had provided. I spread them on the kitchen table between us. I'm talking about your secret bank account, I said, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. I'm talking about the money you've been stealing from our joint accounts to fund your plan to leave me. I'm talking about Linda Morrison and the double life you've been living for the past 8 months. David stared at the documents and photos, his face cycling through emotions I'd never seen before. Surprise, fear, anger, and something that might have been relief. Evelyn, I can explain, he started. No, I interrupted. You can't explain. You can't explain why you've been lying to me every single day for 8 months. You can't explain why you've been stealing our money to plan your escape. You can't explain why you've been planning to divorce me, while pretending to be a loving husband. There is no explanation that makes any of this acceptable. David sank into a chair, looking older than I'd ever seen him. For a moment he looked like he might cry. I never meant for it to happen this way, he said quietly. How did you mean for it to happen? I asked. Were you planning to just disappear one day? Leave me a note? Or were you going to keep living your double life indefinitely? I was going to tell you, David said. I didn't know how. You didn't know how to tell your wife of 32 years that you'd fallen in love with someone else? Patricia interjected. You didn't know how to have an honest conversation about your marriage before you started an affair? David looked at Patricia with something like anger. This doesn't concern you. It concerns me when my sister calls me crying because she's discovered her entire marriage has been a lie, Patricia shot back. It concerns me when I see what your selfishness and cowardice have done to someone I love. David, I said, drawing his attention back to me, I need you to understand something. I'm not the naive woman you've been deceiving for 8 months. I know about Linda. I know about the condo. I know about the money. I know about the divorce attorney you've been meeting with. His eyes widened. He hadn't expected me to know about the attorney. I've filed for divorce, I continued. I've secured legal representation. I've documented your financial deception. And I've protected our marital assets from any further dissipation. Your plan to blindside me and control this process is over. You filed for divorce? David looked genuinely shocked. Did you think I was going to sit here waiting for you to decide when and how to destroy our marriage? I asked. Did you think I was going to let you continue stealing from our joint accounts to finance your new life with your girlfriend? Linda isn't just... David started then stopped himself. Linda isn't just what? I pressed. Your midlife crisis? Your bit on the side. What were you going to say, David? He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I love her. The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting them. Hearing David say he loved another woman, after 32 years of marriage, after everything we'd built together, was devastating in a way I hadn't fully prepared for. But it was also clarifying. Then you should be with her, I said simply. You should have been honest about that 8 months ago instead of living a lie and making me complicit in my own betrayal. David looked up at me with something like surprise. You're not going to fight for our marriage? The question revealed so much about how little he'd understood me, how little he'd considered my feelings throughout this entire deception. He'd expected me to beg, to plead, to try to win him back from his younger girlfriend. He'd expected me to make it easy for him to be the victim in this story. Fight for our marriage? I repeated. David, you destroyed our marriage 8 months ago. when you decided to start a relationship with another woman. You destroyed it when you started hiding money and planning your escape. You destroyed it when you chose to lie to me every single day, instead of having an honest conversation about whatever problems you thought we had. We did have problems, David said, with the first hint of anger I'd heard from him. We've had problems for years. We barely talked anymore. We never did anything together. We were living like roommates. And your solution to that was to have an affair? Patricia interjected. My solution was to find someone who actually wanted to be with me, David replied, his voice rising. Someone who was excited to see me, who wanted to share experiences with me, who made me feel alive again. Did you ever consider talking to your wife about feeling that way? I asked. Did you ever consider marriage counseling? Did you ever consider any solution that didn't involve betraying your wedding vows and lying to my face for 8 months? David was quiet again, and I could see him struggling with how to justify what he'd done. I didn't plan for it to happen, he said finally. Linda and I started working together, and we had so much in common, and she understood the pressures I was facing at work. It just developed naturally. Nothing about this was natural, I said. You made choices, David. You chose to pursue a relationship with another woman. You chose to hide that relationship from me. You chose to steal money from our joint accounts. You chose to plan a future without me while pretending everything was normal. Those were deliberate choices, not things that just happened to you. I know, David said, and for the first time he sounded genuinely remorseful. I know I handled it badly. I know I hurt you. I felt trapped. I felt like our marriage was over anyway. And I was trying to figure out how to move forward without destroying everything. By destroying everything in secret instead of having an honest conversation with your wife? Patricia asked. David looked at her with irritation. Can you please let Evelyn and me discuss this privately? No, Patricia replied firmly. Evelyn asked me to be here, and I'm staying. You forfeited your right to private conversations with my sister by lying to her for 8 months. I looked at David, really looked at him, and tried to find some remnant of the man I'd fallen in love with 34 years ago. He was there, physically, the same face, the same hands, the same voice. But the man I'd married would never have done what David had done. The man I'd married valued honesty, commitment, and partnership above his own comfort. I want you to pack whatever you need for tonight, I told him. You can arrange to get the rest of your things through our attorneys. I'll have all the financial documents you'll need for your lawyer delivered to your office tomorrow. Where am I supposed to go? David asked. I assume you'll stay with Linda, I replied. Since you've been planning to move in with her anyway. David flinched at the directness of my statement. How did you know about the condo? I hired a private investigator, I said. I know about the deposit you made with our savings. I know about the apartment viewings, the furniture shopping, the plans you've been making for your new life. I know about all of it, David. He stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. I never thought you'd do something like that. You never thought I'd protect myself from your deception? I asked. You never thought I'd fight back when I discovered my husband had been stealing from me and planning to abandon me? What exactly did you think I'd do when I found out the truth? I thought. David trailed off, apparently unable to articulate what he'd thought would happen. You thought I'd be the same trusting fool I've been for 8 months. I finished for him. You thought I'd accept whatever story you decided to tell me, whenever you decided to tell it. You thought you could control this situation and manage my reaction. David didn't deny it, which told me everything I needed to know about how little respect he'd had for me throughout this entire deception. I need you to leave now, I said. We'll handle everything else through our attorneys. David stood up slowly, looking around our kitchen as if seeing it for the last time. Evelyn, I never wanted it to end this way. How did you want it to end? I asked. What was your plan for telling me about Linda, about the money, about the divorce you were planning to file? David was quiet for a moment. I thought maybe we could be friends. I thought maybe we could make it amicable for the kids' sake. The audacity of his statement took my breath away. After 8 months of systematic deception, after stealing money and planning his escape, after building a relationship with another woman while pretending to be a devoted husband, David had thought we could be friends. You thought we could be friends, I repeated slowly. After everything you've done, You thought I'd want to maintain a friendly relationship with the man who betrayed me in every possible way. We have 3 children together, David said defensively. We have grandchildren. I thought we could find a way to coexist peacefully. We'll coexist, I replied. Through our attorneys and at family events when absolutely necessary. But we will never be friends, David. You destroyed any possibility of that when you chose deception over honesty, betrayal over respect. David gathered the personal items I'd set aside for him, moving through our house with the hesitant movements of someone who no longer belonged there. As he reached the back door, he turned to look at me one more time. I'm sorry, he said. I really am sorry it happened this way. I'm sorry too, I replied. I'm sorry you chose to handle your feelings like a coward instead of like the man I thought I married. I'm sorry you chose to steal from our joint accounts instead of having an honest conversation about our finances. I'm sorry you chose to plan your future in secret instead of giving me the respect of knowing what you were thinking. And I'm sorry, Patricia added, that it took my sister 8 months to realize what a selfish, dishonest person you'd become. David left without another word, and I watched his car pull out of our driveway for what I knew would be the last time as my husband. The next few months were a blur of attorney meetings, financial negotiations, and paperwork. David's lawyer initially tried to claim that I'd stolen marital assets by withdrawing money from our joint accounts, but Margaret quickly shut that down with documentation of David's secret account and unauthorized transfers. The divorce proceedings revealed even more of David's deception. He'd been hiding money for over a year, not 8 months as I'd initially discovered. He'd taken out a personal loan using our house as collateral without my knowledge. He'd been planning his exit strategy for far longer than even I had realized. Linda Morrison turned out to be aware of David's married status from the beginning of their relationship. She'd been a willing participant in his deception, helping him plan their future while he was still married to me. This wasn't a case of David falling for someone who didn't know he was married. This was a case of 2 adults who decided that their desires were more important than honesty, commitment, or the feelings of anyone they might hurt in the process. The final divorce settlement was favorable to me, largely because David's financial deception and dissipation of marital assets worked against him. I kept the house, received half of all legitimate marital assets, and was awarded spousal support for 10 years. David's secret accounts and hidden assets were split according to community property law, meaning his attempt to steal money from our marriage ended up costing him far more than if he'd been honest from the beginning. More importantly, I kept my dignity and my self-respect. By taking control of the situation once I discovered the truth, by refusing to be a passive victim of David's deception, I'd ensured that the end of our marriage would be on my terms, not his. David married Linda 6 months after our divorce was finalized. They had a small wedding, which our children chose not to attend. Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah had all struggled with their father's betrayal and his apparent lack of remorse for how he'd handled the situation. It's not that he fell in love with someone else, Michael explained to me during one of our regular lunch dates. People fall out of love, relationships end. It's that he lied to you for so long, stole from you, and treated you like you didn't deserve basic honesty and respect. That's what I can't forgive. The children's support meant everything to me during the difficult months of rebuilding my life. They helped me navigate the practical aspects of living alone for the first time in 32 years, but more than that, they helped me remember who I was outside of my marriage to their father. A year after the divorce was finalized, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I sold our house and moved to Portland to be closer to Patricia. Are you sure about this? Susan asked when I told her about my plans. This house is your home. You fought to keep it. I fought to keep it because it represented everything David was trying to take from me, I explained. But now that I've proved I could keep it, I realize I don't actually want it. This house is full of memories of a marriage that turned out to be a lie. I want to start fresh somewhere else. Portland turned out to be exactly what I needed. I found a small but elegant condo near Patricia, got involved in volunteer work at a local literacy center, and slowly began to build a life that was entirely my own. For the first time in my adult life, I made decisions based solely on what I wanted, not on what a husband or children needed from me. I also did something I'd never done before. I started dating. I'm proud of you, Patricia told me over coffee one morning, about 18 months after my divorce was finalized. You went from discovering David's betrayal to building a completely new life in less than 2 years. That takes incredible strength. I didn't feel strong, I admitted. Most of the time, I felt terrified and angry and completely lost. But you didn't let those feelings paralyze you, Patricia pointed out. You used them to fuel action. You investigated, you planned, you protected yourself, and you took control of your own future. That's the definition of strength. Looking back, I realized that discovering David's secret bank account was actually a gift, though it didn't feel like one at the time. If I hadn't found that account, I might have remained oblivious to his deception for months or even years longer. I might have been blindsided by divorce papers, left financially vulnerable by his continued theft of marital assets, and forced to react to his timeline and his narrative about our marriage. Instead, I was able to take control of the situation and ensure that the end of our marriage happened on my terms, with my dignity intact and my future secured. I learned that trust, once broken, cannot simply be repaired with apologies and promises. David's 8 months of systematic deception had destroyed not just our marriage, but any possibility of friendship or respectful coexistence. He'd made choices that revealed a fundamental lack of respect for me as a person and as his partner, and no amount of regret could undo that damage. I also learned that I was capable of far more strength and independence than I'd ever imagined. For 32 years, I'd defined myself primarily as David's wife and our children's mother. I'd forgotten that I was also an intelligent, capable woman who could navigate challenges and build a life according to her own values and desires. David's betrayal was devastating, but it was also liberating. It freed me from a marriage that had become hollow without my realizing it, from a life that was constraining my growth and potential. It forced me to rediscover who I was and who I wanted to become. 3 years after my divorce, I'm happier than I've been in decades. I have a beautiful home that reflects my taste and interests, meaningful work that gives me purpose, and relationships with family and friends that are based on honesty and mutual respect. I've traveled to places I'd always wanted to see, taken classes I'd always wanted to take, and pursued interests that had been put on hold during my marriage. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if David had approached his feelings differently. If he'd been honest about his dissatisfaction with our marriage, if he'd suggested counseling or had frank conversations about how we could improve our relationship, if he'd been willing to work on our problems instead of abandoning our partnership for something that seemed more exciting, we might have been able to save our marriage, or we might have decided together that divorce was the best option for both of us. Either way, we could have handled the situation with integrity and respect for each other, and for the life we'd built together. But David chose deception over honesty, betrayal over respect, and immediate gratification over long-term integrity. Those choices revealed who he really was as a person, and they made it impossible for me to continue trusting him or wanting to share my life with him. The secret bank account that shattered my world ended up being the key to my freedom. It showed me that I couldn't trust the man I'd built my life around, but it also showed me that I could trust myself to handle whatever challenges life might bring. And that knowledge, painful as it was to acquire, has been worth everything.